All right. Well, here we are. Here we are again. Good to see everybody. I'm going to be brief. I think Tom has some statement. Well, he has a statement he wants to make as well. As we look to the session ahead, it's important that we recognize that Minnesotans don't want to see a repeat this year of 2011. Instead of partisan gridlock and distracting constitutional amendments, Minnesotans would prefer we work together on the things that really matter to them, and that is getting people back to work and getting our economy going. That's what all the leaders have said as we have led into this session. I think probably every representative and senator has said as we lead into this session. But it's really important this year, more than ever, that those aren't just words, but they translate into action. Right now, there have been no hearings scheduled in the House Jobs and Economic Development Committee. And we've already seen, as you well know, several constitutional amendments that have been introduced by Republicans that have nothing to do with creating jobs. Our priorities this session, as we've said all along, are creating jobs, strengthening our economy, and getting a strong middle class going, not divisive constitutional amendments. And if we work on those things together, I think that we're going to make some great progress this year, and I hope that that's how the session ends. Up. Senator Bakk.
This was an extremely difficult and painful first week of the session in the Minnesota Senate. On Tuesday, the first day of the legislative session, the Republican majority engaged in one of the most shameful actions I've ever seen at the Capitol. Why was it so shameful? Because this wasn't an ordinary partisan debate between elected officials. No, this was a partisan attack on the hardworking men and women who work to serve the people of Minnesota at the state Senate. As you know, the Republican members of the Senate Rules Committee voted to cut nearly $500,000 from the staffing budget of the Democratic minority. According to Cal Ludeman, the Republicans' hand-picked Secretary of the Senate, that will cost our caucus 12 to 14 staff members, roughly one-third of our entire staff. How many members of their own staff did the Republican majority choose to cut? 0. So how did the Republican majority defend such a blatantly unfair and partisan attack? In committee, Senator Senjum said it was because the DFL minority staffing budget, even after these cuts were enacted, would be, quote, $160,000 more than the Republican majority's budget, even though you're 7 members less at this point, he said. The budget document that was presented in committee by Secretary Ludeman presented the same information. Sounds reasonable, right? According to the Republicans, we have bigger salary budget for fewer members, and their proposed cuts would simply level the playing field and make things more equitable. The only problem is Senator Senjum's statement is completely untrue. Yesterday morning, our caucus asked the Secretary of the Senate's office to supply us with a current roster of the Senate staff. They gave us a hard copy of the Senate staff roster, which we spent hours inputting into spreadsheets so that we could get the truth about the Senate budget. What we found disproves the claims made by the Republican members of the Rules Committee, as well as the handout presented by Secretary Ludeman. Is the Senate DFL minority budget larger than the Republican majority? No. In terms of total staff salary, the Senate Republican budget is over 60% larger than the staffing budget in our caucus, even when we ignore the fact that the Republican majority is currently in the process of hiring several more staff. Furthermore, even if you remove the committee administrators from the equation, the Republican majority's staffing budget is still 24% larger than ours in the minority. In other words, comparing non-committee related caucus staff, the Senate Republicans are currently spending $481,000 more than we are in the minority. In reality, if we were to make the Republicans' proposed $444,000 cut to our staff, the Republican caucus would then have a $925,000 more to spend on non-committee staff than would our caucus. That means that the claim made by the Republican leaders that our caucus would have $160,000 more to serve fewer members was wrong by over $1 million. So now we're left wondering, why were we presented with such misleading data at the Senate Rules hearing? There seems to be three possibilities. One, somebody made a mistake. Two, somebody lied. Three, somebody intentionally manipulated the data to mislead members of the Senate committee and the public. Believe me, I intend to get answers to these questions. Whatever the explanation, we now know that the only justification the Republican majority could give for their blatantly partisan decision was completely false. We also know that the vote in the Tuesday's Rules Committee was taken under the influence of misleading and inaccurate information provided by a Senate employee who is supposed to be the administrator of the entire Senate. I believe it's important that we revisit the issue as soon as possible. Later today, I will be sending a letter to Senator Senjum, the Senate Majority Leader and Chair of the Rules Committee. I will explain that the information we were provided regarding the Senate budget was misleading and inaccurate, and I will ask him to call another Rules Committee hearing as soon as possible. During that hearing, I hope that we will accomplish three important tasks: review accurate, detailed, and up-to-date numbers regarding the Senate budget, receive a full explanation as to why members of the Rules Committee were providing misleading and inaccurate information from the Secretary of the Senate, and reconsider our vote on the Senate budget and delay further action until we've had the opportunity to draft a new budget plan that fairly distributes staffing reductions between the two caucuses. Let me end with two important points. All the raw data we reviewed before making this announcement was provided to us by the Secretary of the Senate. It is public data. If you'd like to see the information we were provided or the spreadsheets we prepared using the data, just contact my staff. We are not here to complain about having to make staffing cuts in the Senate. These are difficult times, and the legislature is cutting throughout state government. We should not be immune, and we have always supported sharing the pain whenever difficult cuts are made. Over the last several years, the DFL voted to cut millions out of the Senate budget. And when we did so, we made sure that those cuts were distributed equitably. But this is a story about fairness. It's a story about honesty. And it's a story about an abuse of power that will impact the careers and lives of many people. The Republican majority's actions set a terrible precedent for our institution and a terrible tone for the rest of this session. And the fact that these decisions were made while relying on inaccurate, misleading, or fabricated data only further erodes trust within our body. We know there will have to be cuts. We're just asking the majority party to not go down this dangerous partisan path. The men and women who work at the Minnesota Senate are talented, dedicated, hardworking, and they don't deserve to have their careers and livelihoods endangered in an ugly partisan game. Times are tough, and cuts will have to be made. But let's do it fairly, and more importantly, let's do it honestly. That concludes my prepared remarks. We've handed out to you, as best as we can calculate from the information we received from the Secretary of the Senate, a spreadsheet that shows the salaries. That's what we have to go with. We don't know what the benefit costs are, but generally health care, no matter which caucus you work for, pension benefits, no matter which caucus you work for, I think are pretty equal. So what we do, the information we do have is based on salaries. And when you look at the salaries of the majority caucus, where there are 70 people and they're currently holding some vacancies, it shows about over $3.2 million. And you look over at the minority caucus's numbers, 42 people, about $2 million. Now, I want to be real clear. The document that they presented to the Rules Committee says, in the document, this page here, for those of you that still have it. The new biennial base for caucus legislative support not related to committee function. That's what they told us. Not related to committee functions show the minority caucus at about 2.6 million. I have no dispute with that. I mean, by the time you take our 2 million and you add in all the benefits, that may be fairly close. But they show that the majority caucus is about just over 2.4 million. And I can't get to 2.4 million looking at the majority side. The only way that I can get there, I mean, even if you take out all of the CAs, you get to around you take 3.226 and you take out the committee administrators at 731,000, you can get to about 2.5 million in salary, but then you have to add the benefits on. So that puts them back somewhere up over 3 million with the benefits. So their characterization that after the cuts, the Democrats' staffing budget is still $160,000 higher than the Republican staffing numbers for non-committee function I can't get to that number. The only way I could get there is if I took the legislative assistants off of this line. If I took all the legislative assistants off for the majority caucus and called them all committee staff, then I guess maybe you can get to where we have comparable budgets. But I guess my question is, what is committee-related staff? I think the assumption of the Rules Committee members was when you take the committee administrators off. But there clearly is more to it than that, because you can't arrive at their number by taking the committee administrators alone off. It appears that, to me, that they took the Democrats' 42 people and they compared them to their research and legislative staff, and they didn't include anybody else. So they included around 17, 18 people, and they compared it to our 42. And they said, well, the Democrats are spending more money than us. So I think that's the premise under which I want to have another Rules Committee hearing and find out either we were incredibly misled or these numbers that we were presented in the Rules Committee are just blatantly wrong.
Senator, is this something you think the public should care about?
I think the public should care because this is a blatant partisan act based on inaccurate information. And I think if there ever was a session where the public wants the tone to be different, where they want people at the legislature in both political parties to get along based on we're still in the shadow of a historic government shutdown. We've got a Congress that looks pretty dysfunctional. The Minnesotans I know want us to figure out how we can get along, get the people's work done in a cooperative way. This is a blatant partisan attack in the very first week of the session.
So why did you do it?
You would have to ask them that.
Senator, in terms of confirmation, Senator Ortman says it's unlikely that Senator Anderson will be confirmed on Monday. What does that say about tone, and where do you stand on Ellen Anderson's confirmation?
I think they have no reason not to confirm Senator Anderson. I don't believe she has a voting, or she's taken over 200 votes over at the PUC. I think when you look at that, you'll find that almost all of those votes were unanimous. I mean, I don't think they have any reason to not confirm her based on her job performance. And I think it would be wrong. And I guess I would personally ask the new communications director of the Senate, when he was appointed acting commissioner by Governor Plenty, there were members of the Senate who wanted to take down his confirmation, him and former Representative McElroy. And I stood up for him. I stood up for him in the Majority Leader's office and said, no, I don't think that's right. They haven't done anything so that their job performance should indicate we should reject their confirmation. And I think until Senator Anderson does something, casts some vote that gives them some reason to simply take her down because she's a former DFL senator, is another blatant partisan attack. But this time, it's an attack on the administration and the governor.
Senator, isn't this about former Senator Anderson's record on nuclear power specifically, and about the moratorium, lifting the moratorium on new plants in Minnesota? Isn't that kind of the underlying thing here?
It's not related to her performance in her job, I don't believe. I guess we'll ask that question on the floor of the Senate when they make a decision to take her confirmation off, is what votes has she taken at the PUC that give you reason to believe she can't be a good commissioner? And I think trying to create some kind of a linkage to her tenure as a senator, I think is unfair to the new position that she holds today.
Would DFL be unanimous in supporting her?
We don't take caucus positions. In fact, in my entire 10 years in the state Senate, not one time have we said in our caucus, we're all going to go out there and we're unanimously going to do something. And I don't intend to ask the caucus to do that this time. I think people will vote how they think is appropriate based on Senator Anderson's performance as a commissioner. I think all members of the Senate, not just my caucus, should come to the conclusion that she's been doing a good job, and I would be surprised if there were any Democrats that did not support Senator Anderson's confirmation.
Senator Bakk, what power do you have, if any, other than requesting, going back to the issue on staffing, other than requesting another hearing, another committee meeting? What could you do?
Well, I believe that the members of the Rules Committee made a vote based on information that was provided to them that was inaccurate. And I think you'd have to ask the Republican members of the Rules Committee. I would be very surprised if the Republican members of the Rules Committee knew the facts of what was in front of them. And Senator Senjum can certainly not hold a Rules Committee hearing on this subject, but someday he's going to hold a Rules Committee hearing before this session is over. And I'm not going to let this lie by itself. People made a vote based on very inaccurate and misleading data.
If this inaccurate information is presented to the Senate Rules Committee, is that eventually a subject for the Ethics Committee to look at?
I haven't given that any thought. It is possible for a member of the Senate to file an ethics complaint under the rules against a staff person of the Senate. I think that's a very dangerous precedent to start. I don't know if it's been done, but at first blush, I would be very reluctant to do that and get in. That takes the tit for tat to a whole nother level when you start pursuing people that are just employees of the Senate.
Representative Thissen, has there been any of this controversy on budget in the House, on internal budget?
No.
And why?
Well, I think, I don't know all the details, of the Senate budget. I know that the House budget, because of nonpartisan staff and because of, former Speaker Kelleher's management and now Speaker Zeller's management, have dealt with some of these issues farther in advance, perhaps, than in the Senate.
What do you gentlemen think about the move to put a constitutional amendment on voter photo ID on the ballot? It seems like it's rolling forward in both chambers.
Well, I have both privately and publicly, I think asked Senator Senjum not to do that. I think there is some middle ground somewhere between what they sent to the governor for a veto last year and what a constitutional amendment would do that could be worked out, and we could find some bipartisan support, including the governor.
Where would that middle ground be?
I haven't been there. There's a bipartisan working group been working on this. I haven't been involved in it, so I don't know the issues well enough to know exactly what it would be. But just at first blush, I think, well, if just a carpenter thinking, if I come to the polls and I don't have a photo ID, why don't you take a picture of me? And then put it in your, whatever the database is that the Secretary of State holds. It doesn't seem, rather than deny them the right to vote, it seems like there's another way to get at that.
We take a picture of them and store it in a database and then reference it next time they come in and see if it's the same person.
Permanently stored in the voter file database. Seems like there's a way. Like I say, I haven't been involved in those conversations, but it seems like rather than tell somebody, no, you can't vote, we can take a picture of them.
You know, and the fact of the matter is, on any given day, there's 20 to 30,000 Minnesotans, because it takes a while to get your ID back when you lose your wallet, but there's thousands of Minnesotans who lose their wallets every day. And so if you kind of total those up every 10 days, you know, that in itself is going to deny a lot of people the right to vote if we go down this path. So there's a lot of practical things that don't make sense around this. I do think that there's a better chance that if we actually sit down, look at the slew of problems that, for instance, Representative Kiffmeyer's bill last year would have created in our state, from military veterans, military folks not being able to vote, to the cost, to all kinds of things, that if we actually sit down, and I think this bipartisan group has done that, we can come up with a plan that gets at the fundamental issue, which is making sure we have high integrity in our elections, which I believe we do in Minnesota, but kind of respond to some of those issues in a way that's not going to keep people from voting.
There's also talk of a right to work constitutional amendment, and what would each of your gentlemen's stances be on that?
You know, what we know is that if we go down the path of a right to work amendment, the wages of Minnesotans are going to fall. I think today what we want, or what most Minnesotans want, are their wages actually to go up, and that's union jobs and non-union jobs. This, again, is something that we should deal with in the legislative process. The Republicans, like on voter ID, are trying to make an end run around our system of checks and balances because they can't get their way. That's not what Minnesotans want. They don't want people picking up their ball and going home away from the constitutional representative government that we've set up just because they can't get their way. In fact, they want it the opposite, which is to come together to try to see if we can find a common ground on the things that really matter to Minnesotans. And I would imagine if you walk down the street in St. Paul today and talk to every person that walks by and says, what's the most important thing the legislature should be focusing on? They would say maybe schools. They would say maybe probably jobs and getting the economy going. I bet $100 that they would not say, I want to make sure that people have to show an ID when they vote. That's the most important thing to me. Or they would not say, I want to take away people's rights to collectively bargain. Those just aren't the priorities for Minnesotans, and we should get away from it.
I do not and will never support right-to-work legislation in the Constitution in our state. From all the conversation there's been about constitutional amendments, I think there is only one that I support. And I actually co-authored the bill, and it's not new to me because I was the chief author of it in the last biennium. And it would require a super majority vote of the legislature to put something on the ballot. I had a bill that did that in the last biennium, and for whatever reason, the leadership in the House and the Senate decided not to move it forward onto the ballot. But I am the co-author on a bill this year that will require a supermajority. If amending the Constitution is a good idea, we ought to have a bipartisan vote to put it on the ballot.
How much bipartisan support do you have on that?
Well, I guess we'll find out if they make a decision to give it a hearing or not. Seems like that's the amendment that should go on the ballot. It's the only one that I have heard of so far that I plan to vote for.
That would have to be an amendment itself.
Yeah, it would have to be an amendment, correct.
How high would the bar be, supermajority?
I believe the bill that's been introduced is two-thirds. The bill that I actually had in the last biennium was 60%, which is the same threshold we require for general obligation bonding. So I'm not necessarily wed to the two-thirds number, but I'm not the chief author of the bill. But for me, like I say, it's not a new issue to me. I was the chief author of the 60% bill in the last biennium.
So before, we may hear from Senator Ortman again, but before that happens, there's a quote here that says the minority is given $160,000 more than the majority to manage their budget. Is that true or false? I mean, do you still get more than the Republicans do?
Well, you could argue that we get $2 million more if they count nobody, if they just count everybody as committee staff. I mean, I think the problem here is they are, the only way I can get to this conclusion is if they're taking over 50 of their staff and saying, well, they all work for committees, so we don't count them. I mean, you can't, the math doesn't work unless you do that. So really, they're going to, I guess I need to get an explanation in the Rules Committee. Do you really have over 50 of your partisan staff staffing 15 committees? Okay? That's the only way you can get to a number like that, is if you virtually assign almost everybody, except for leadership and research, to committees. And then, remember, now their line says that that comparison is made based on after you take out the committee staff. So the question is, who's committee staff? I mean, I think the Rules Committee members thought, I certainly thought, that committee staff was the committee administrators. But it may well be every legislative assistant that works for their caucus is considered committee staff. That's kind of the only way you can get to the math.
So the answer, according to his information, I think is no, that's not right.
I think I said it was inaccurate and $1 million off.
You're also being accused on Twitter already by people on the Republican side of this being more about your own personal situation with your spouse. What would you say to that?
Really? I mean, I guess she spent years and years in the House, but she's probably one of the most senior staff in the Senate. I mean, if people believe in seniority, and I'm a union guy that believes in seniority, I think she probably stays. If she was one of the least senior people, you might be able to say that, but I'm somebody that has always believed in seniority, so I don't know why that would. That's the defense they have? Really?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly the kind of attacks, the personal attacks that people in Minnesota don't want going on. Senator Bakk just looked at the facts. The unfortunate reality is the Republicans showed last session, and they're showing with a comment like that they don't care about the facts, but they're going to resort to personal attacks. So that's just wrong that they're going in that direction. I hope that they retract that. They should retract that statement immediately. That's not the kind of communication shop you ought to be running, Representative Swigert.
It's not from the Republican majority. It's from Republican tweeters.
My wife was staff to the legislature 20 years before I got here.
Senator Bakk, you've been in the Senate now 10 years, been around this place longer than that. The Senate's role in this building, and the Senate as an institution, it's been through a lot of changes, and I don't remember that we've ever had a budget fight in the Senate quite like this one has developed. What's going on with the state Senate in a big picture kind of way?
I have never seen such arrogance on the part of leadership. Senator Senjum called me over last Thursday, a week ago, to present me the budget. And it showed what we passed. All DFL staffing cuts and none for their caucus. I told him last Thursday, David, this is very bad politics for you. And you need to rethink this before you bring this to the Rules Committee. And for whatever reason, that wasn't done. Previously, I believe the way the Senate has operated, when the minority had a concern about an issue, the two leaders sat down and tried to work it out. But when I expressed the concern, it stayed the same. I hate to characterize it as an abuse of power, but it feels like it if you're in the minority. And I don't believe that's how the Senate, it hasn't been the tradition of the Senate.
Before we move on here, Leader Thissen, on property tax levy limits, a bill that Chair Davis looks like you need to move forward with. What's your stance on that generally?
You know, Chair Davids is looking desperately for anything he can do to take back the huge problems he created for 95% of Minnesotans last year by his attack on property tax relief in Minnesota. And, you know, levy limits aren't necessary. You know, it's something, I guess, that we will look at. You know, we're interested in making sure that that this property tax issue is something that's taken care of. But every time you do that, we leave so many loopholes. You know, I think actually Senator Ortman is the one that called it a Swiss cheese approach to property tax policy, right? The bottom line is they're looking desperately for anything because they know they made a huge mistake by raising Minnesotans' property taxes all over the state last year.
And the only correct way to do that, in your judgment, is to restore the homestead?
Well, I think that's something that we should look at. You know, I think we'll be looking at a lot of ideas about how we address that issue.
Every day that goes by makes the likelihood of getting a Vikings bill on the floor of the Senate harder. So That's my take. I don't know if they made progress last night or not, but it appeared like Minneapolis City Council threw a wrinkle in it yesterday, so are we further apart than we were a week ago? Maybe.
Does that take even more pressure off you guys for any action this year on that? The fact that the local, they don't seem to have a solid local partner anywhere that has funding?
Well, they have a local partner, Ramsey County.
But they have a funding plan that the Republicans won't allow.
But the Vikings were asked to go out and find a local partner, and they did that. They can find a willing local partner, I suppose, in another state. I mean, if that's what the Republicans would like them to do, I guess maybe we don't have to raise taxes that way. You know, they can.
Does this fundamentally fall back to pull tabs as a way of,
Well, I'm the one that actually, in the governor's office on the 17th of October, that suggested the idea of electronic pull tabs. Those charitable organizations do good work back in the community, but that only picks up the state portion. You've still got the issue of the local government portion, which is where, even if I were to say, yeah, I think we can put up 12 votes for poll tabs, which is the same number that the Republicans in the minority put up for the Twins, which is what I've said I'm willing to do, even if I could get that, the issue is still out there of, well, where's the local portion going to come from? It doesn't appear Minneapolis has the votes, and it doesn't appear the Republican leadership in the Senate is willing to let Ramsey County do what they'd like to do.
both potential host communities have a similar kind of a problem, or with this taxation issue and the referendum, issue. Do you see this evolving away from a local partner, or at least a substantial reduction in the proportion of the contribution that a local partner has to kick in toward more state contribution? Governor Dayton has kind of gone that way. Is that a realistic way to go? That the state does more, whether it be through poll tabs or whatever?
I guess if we're going to do it as a state facility and the state pays for it, I got a great location in Duluth. It's the location of the old Central School, and if any have ever been there, it's way up on the hill, overlooks Lake Superior. We could put a glass wall, be the most beautiful stadium in the country.
Now we have 10 proposals.
And the land is available.
Okay, thank you.